Good evening, folks. This is Eddie Carson, and you are listening to Race Matters. And you're listening to Race Matters here at WJOP, LP Newburyport, Joppa Radio 93.6. And so I'm excited to take a little bit of time out of your night for us to kind of talk about some serious topics as it relates to race. One soul brother to the next, that's what we do. And that's why it's important to do what folks are afraid to do, which is to talk about race. Race is a reality. Race is ubiquitous. Race is formative. Race is something that we must really address and delve into in so many different ways. Tonight's show, we're going to focus on a topic of Black liberation. And what does Black liberation mean? There are a lot of different ways we can delve into this conversation. And so I'm going to introduce the topic, but note, it is not the last time we're going to spend some time thinking about this. As we talk about Black liberation, though, I want to just continue to be that soul brother, and I want to give a shout out to brother Bubba Wallace. Bubba Wallace is a NASCAR racer. He won Talladega, folks. Yes, he is only the second Black person to win a major race like this. So we're really excited for that brother in terms of what he represents in many ways. You know, as we talk about Black liberation, a lot of ways to look at it, to define it, to think about what does Black liberation mean. The most obvious thing, of course, is for us to think about the fact that Black liberation must speak to this notion of Black freedom. And how do we get at Black freedom here? You know, I sit there and I think about a number of things, right? I can spend days talking about this, and I'm going to try not to do that because I want you to hang in there with me for a little bit, because what I have to say and what I have to share is important. It's serious. It's a reality. It's something that I hope you'll learn and glean a little bit of information from. And, you know, as we move through this, I think it's important for us to keep in mind, too, that I do have a distinct point of view. I'm a Black man from the American South. Kind of coming out of Montgomery, Alabama, up here to the New England area here in Newburyport, being an academic who focuses a lot on 20th century race and religion and what does that mean for the color line here in the 21st century. And as I really profess to critique the past, I want to think about the past as we analyze the future, the present and the future. You know, I guess if I could say this, I am how do I say this? I guess from an exegetical point, if we can use that language, which means that word means I am a critic. Someone who interprets, who criticizes. I'm not a history buff at all, but I examine the past for the fact that I have to offer some semblance of a social commentary for us moving forward. You know, I want to start off by thinking about Black liberation, and I want to take us back to our own education, our own school. And so if you think back to your own schooling, you know, whether it's primary school, high school, college, graduate school, junior college, some kind of trade school, anything of that particular nature, you know, in your knowledge of your understanding of Black liberation and African-American people, or African-American peoples, if we could use that, you know, ask yourself about the type of courses you took. Did you take courses that really focuses on the plight of Black people, something that was centered around Black people, but yet let's just kind of expand that just a little bit more, something that really forces us to think about people of color in general? Was your education centered around that, or was it centered around the storyline of the notion of the dominant narrative, the master narrative, which is really going to be whiteness? We need to learn everything that's white, but yet we can have these peripheral examples of other people who have contributed to this American narrative that's here. And oftentimes that narrative is not always in the best light in many ways. When I was in college, when I was an undergraduate, I remember taking this Civil War course. And in this Civil War course, I took it with this individual who, really loved the Civil War. I remember walking into his office and he had this big old Confederate flag hanging up there, and I would just stare at that thing and stare at that thing. And I remember once asking him, why do you have that flag? Don't you think that's problematic for people who look like me? And he gave me this narrative of heritage, of the importance of history, of symbols, and we'll kind of categorize that under the idea of white symbolism. And so in this popular class, right, a lot of folks tried to rush into it. I remember sitting there the whole time, and there would be some gestures to folks who may have done some work to address the challenges of American race and slavery. That's always on the dial when we talk about the American Civil War. He may give one little note to some radical white brothers, maybe someone like a William Lloyd Garrison, who grew up in Newburyport, migrated down to Boston, started the Liberator. And we're going to talk about him later, not on this show, but down the road. Maybe David Walker's Appeal, talking about the American Colonization Society and how you have this vanguard of abolitionists who wanted to really help black folks, and some who had to even come to the fruition and reality of growth, and that is shipping black people back to Africa is probably not the way to do this. But in this course, we never really delved into the heart of the matter with what I would call a more analytical approach to the American Civil War when it comes to the dynamics of race. You see, folks, the American Civil War is part of the crisis of American identity. The framers, some of you may call them the founding fathers, and that's language that I don't use all that often, would speak to the fact that we've never really wholeheartedly addressed the issue of slavery in the Constitution. You look at the Constitution now, and we still have not really addressed the issue of slavery in the Constitution. And so those folks really kind of put it on hold for a period of time until we get to the crisis moment where the American Civil War broke out. And so in thinking about this, I remember just being alone in some ways, really chewing on this content, not having a mentor who looked like me to share that information with at that time. Mentors are challenging. For me, it was always some of these big, broad intellectuals, the books that I was reading in which I found some type of akin, some type of mentorship through their stuff, whether it was me being a junior in high school and first being exposed to the workings and the writings of Cornel West, or when I was an undergrad, I had this professor named Mark Allen Elrod, and I remember just really liking this white brother, someone who was empathetic, had some soul, and really had this sense of understanding for the marginalized and the oppressed people. The brother's still white now, don't get me wrong. But you know what? I had to find those likings in a place where there weren't a lot of folks, if any, who looked like me in a department made up of a sea of whiteness that's there. And so we look at other folks who've grown up and gone through school, and they've never had mentors who look like them, particularly people of color, especially black folks, someone to engage in conversations about the critique and the criticalness of race, someone to help them understand that what does black liberation mean for someone like me, exploring the narrative of the crisis known as the American Civil War. I think oftentimes maybe this is a product of the fact that when we talk about the population of black folks here in this country, we're talking about roughly, according to the last census, I haven't seen the most recent one, 13%, folks, 13%. That is the African American, hence for black population in this country, 13%. And so at 13%, the question really boils down to the dynamic of power. How much power do black folks have? We haven't accumulated a whole lot of wealth, which we're going to delve into a little bit more when we talk about liberation. What does the absence of power mean in terms of trying to make a lot of decisions that's there? And I was talking to some students in my climate justice course today, we're talking about redlining, and I appreciate this soul sister in class who said, I had never heard the word redlining before until this course. And it got me pondering and thinking about all the other things students don't know as it relates to the oppression of people of color, the oppression of black folks, and how we have been able to navigate our lives through that. You know, as we wrestle with this notion of black liberation, you know, we have to think about other terms such as black nihilism. And we think about black nihilism philosophically, you know, that really means things such as the end of emancipation through politics in any hope of addressing the color line. And addressing a color line, particularly as it relates to black people, is pointless. And, you know, again, the first time I came across that word black nihilism was, I guess I was probably a sophomore, junior in high school, reading Race Matters. And as I've continued to grow up, delve into my own scholarship, I've explored that term a little bit, particularly under the guise of what does that mean for the idea of victimization. And I'm not here to say black people are victims. We're a product of a crime committed by a country that has allowed white supremacy to run rampant for a period of time, but we're not victims. And we don't profess to be victims, but we are here dialing it up just a little bit to talk about the stories that need to be heard. So let's think about that for a little bit. Let's go back to this Civil War course. And in a Civil War course, right, you don't have to take a course to know this. On April 12, 1865, the American Civil War officially ended when the Union Army accepted the Confederacy's resignation and defeat from this conflict. And with this defeat came this sense, and this usually happens with defeat, of shame, of guilt, of wrongdoing. You're on the wrong side of history, but not in American society. In American society, the symbol of whiteness really became professed through symbols such as Confederate monuments. Another conversation we're going to have another day. Things such as the Confederate flag and how people continue to parade that flag around. When I see it, oftentimes I sit there and I think, is this just another way of trying to keep me enslaved to remind me that my black liberation doesn't really exist? You see, we think back to the end of the American Civil War in 1865. Folks forget that Congress did pass what was known as the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, think about that for a second. The Civil Rights Act of 1866. Most people think, oh, Brother Carson, no. You mean the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? Isn't that pretty much what Dr. Martin Luther King was giving all those speeches about? No, 100 years before that work of Brother King and LBJ came to fruition, there was already a Civil Rights Act in place. Let me read it for you, like a little bit of it, right? It stated, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first declaration of civil rights in the United States, stated that citizens of every race and color, without regard to any previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude, shall have the same rights in every state and territory in the United States, to full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property, as is enjoyed by white citizens. If we think about that for a little bit, how could that possibly be true? You know, days after the surrender of the Confederacy, that brother Abraham Lincoln, whom Frederick Douglass admired, and I'm a soul brother who loves Douglass. Lincoln rode into Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of slaveholders. One of the former capitals, right? The other one happened to be my hometown of Montgomery, Alabama. He stood upon the stairs of the former Confederate Capitol building and told a large gathering crowd of black people days into this freedomness. This is what this brother said. In reference to you, colored people, we don't use that language anymore. Let me say, God has made you free. God has made you free. Although you have been deprived of your God-given rights by your so-called masters, those slaveholders who enslaved us, you are now as free as I am. And that's the first mistake Lincoln made. We were never free as Abraham Lincoln was. We were never as free as the poorest, brokest white person living in the Appalachian Mountains. We're never at that particular point, never free. Lincoln's going to go on to say that, and if those that claim to be your superiors do not know that you are free, take the sword and bayonet and teach them that you are. Can you imagine a black man taking a sword and a bayonet to a white man? I mean, we're going to talk about the Jim Crow period for a period of time where black people were lynched and jailed just for whistling at a white woman, smiling at a white woman, crossing the street where it said white folks and not colored folks. So there's none of this sense that we're going to teach white folks about what does it mean to be free and to be liberated. For God created, as Lincoln would state, all men free, given to each the same rights as life, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness. Again, we need to really critique and dial that back a little bit because we know Thomas Jefferson is going to borrow some of that language from the earlier Enlightenment person known as John Locke, who would talk about the sense of property. And none of those things, happiness nor property, were a part of the black person's plight whatsoever. And that wasn't just a reality at all. See, those are the things that we have to struggle with. Those are the things that we need to talk about. We need to teach. We need to really make pronounced in many ways because oftentimes people will say, we're a growing country and we've changed. We've moved in so many ways. But yet, if we think about life, liberty, and happiness, and property, I'm not so sure about that. You know, black people were not freed into an American dream, as folks oftentimes like to pronounce, this great country where the American dream is that and set forth by everyone. Anyone and everyone can do what is in front of them. But into what Brother Malcolm X would say was an American nightmare of economic inequality and unchecked injustice. You know, the full extent of this inequality was masked by racial terrorism. You free black folks, we go through that period known as Reconstruction, and yet we allow the rise of the KKK. The government tried to suppress the KKK, but the KKK continues to come back. And yet now we get to the 21st century and we see all types of forms of white supremacy that's there. And let me tell you, white supremacy are not just folks who wear hoods. They wear bow ties. They wear ties, suits, jackets. They operate in spaces of businesses, boardrooms, medical institutions, educational institutions. They make a lot of decisions. The banking industry, in which you have a credit system that in many ways disenfranchises black people in different ways too. So we can talk about this American terrorism that Malcolm X really confessed for a long period of time. 100 years after emancipation, African Americans, black folks, we dismantled the last vestiges of legal discrimination. De jure, right? De jure segregation. Jim Crow, the legal aspects of the legalization of discrimination that existed. And we did so through the civil rights movements of the 1960s. Now, we're talking about doing this in the 1960s, but yet, remember, I told you, we already started having these conversations in the 19th century in the year 1866. So what did 1866 mean? Nothing. What did 1964 mean? Well, we can debate and we can say nothing, particularly because the legacies of white supremacy have continued in many ways to operate in a way that has not allowed for the freedom and the expansion and the liberation of black people in different ways. And that's what we have to keep in mind. We think back to the civil rights movement, and we think back to this idea that the excitement of that movement quickly faded as American cities combusted with black people who were angry and disillusioned at being locked out of accessing the riches of American society, couldn't get granted this American dream that was so often professed in a lot of different ways. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans participated in the uprisings in search of resolutions to the problems such as lead poisoning. You had issues of rat infestations, people going hungry, malnutrition, the legacies of police brutality continued even in the 1960s into the 1970s. Black folks taking over universities and demanding that if you're not going to talk about our history in the ways that you need to talk about our history, then we're going to hold this building hostage until you create programs and departments such as the Afro-American or African-American Studies Department, where all folks of all backgrounds in an interracial capacity could engage in understanding about the reality of real history that's there. We want to talk about things such as unemployment and underemployment for black folks, poor schools propagated by this notion of where you live and property tax and values, the permission granted in many ways by the U.S. government for the allowance of redlining to come in place, and the persisting issue of poverty. You know, we think about these things that are problematic. You know, and this is where I think liberals and radicals converge and demand that blacks should have greater political control in their communities, that real sense of freedom. But a freedom had in one era been imagined as inclusion in the mainstream of American society, including the admittance to its political and financial institutions. Then the last 50 years have yielded what I would call a mixed record. See, I get a lot of pushback because I say that the civil rights movement of the 1960s was a failure. It didn't go far enough. And we're continuing to struggle with liberation here in the 21st century. Now, that's not to dismiss all the great stuff Brother King did, Brother Malcolm did, right? Martin and Malcolm were just amazing human beings in terms of all the stuff they did, as well as along with some of those beautiful sisters along the way and queer folks who were doing that work during that time period too. But liberation is something that we have to question in terms of the record. Indeed, since the last gaps of the black insurgency in the 1970s, there are many measures of black accomplishments and achievements in this country where black people were never intended to survive as free people. And we have. This past summer, we know that part of our liberation is the welcoming of the celebration of Juneteenth. Juneteenth being my holiday because, as Frederick Douglass once professed, I'm not sure the 4th of July was really meant for me. If we think back to the language of Thomas Jefferson thinking about life, liberty, and happiness. Or this idea that we have arrived in terms of this sense of black liberation because a black man once occupied the White House in Barack Obama. That's a sense of achievement that's there. You know, I wonder when we think about that. You know, let's think about it. For those who consider mastery of American politics and black political representation as the highest expressions of inclusion in the mainstream, then we are surely in the heyday of American race relations. But are we in those heydays as we deal with this trepidation? We go from a black man, or better yet, as my friend Sarah and I were just talking about before I hopped on the show, the one-drop rule, Barack Obama, a black man, or as America sees, since race is a social construct and is defined by how society sees one, a person who was a product of an interracial marriage, but yet he still had one drop of black blood that made him black, though he was raised primarily in a white household. And yet after that brother left, there was this reaction to having a person of color in a White House. Not to get into politics, but I'm a black man, and that means politics are real for me. And we see the reaction to people who look like me, whether it's the birth of Donald Trump in the White House. And Donald Trump is just a symptom of a bigger problem that goes back to the Civil War, goes back to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, or that congressman out of Iowa named John King. John King once stated that Tell me what great societies or great civilizations black people built. Everything is predicated on a white man, and we have to protect the national institution of whiteness. This is a congressman professing white supremacy. And just for the record, too, because I do want to be clear, I'm paraphrasing what John King said there. And so that's not a direct quote at all, but worth taking a look at in many ways. Paradoxically, at a moment when African Americans have achieved what no rational person could have imagined at the end of the Civil War, we have simultaneously entered a new period of black liberation, black radicalization, black protests, black identity, trying to understand the fact that the United States is our country, because without the labor and the products of black people, there is no United States. The United States professes to be a white country, but it is a country that's inviting for all folks, black folks particularly, Asian folks, immigrants, indigenous peoples who occupied this space for a long period of time, especially in the area of Newburyport. No one knows what will come of this new political development, this sense of black liberation in the 21st century. But many know that causes of its gestation, right? And we know those causes. For as much success as some African Americans have achieved, right? And we've achieved a lot. We still make up 13% of the population. We, as a people, don't have a lot of wealth nor power. Most people say, well, come on, brother. Again, Barack Obama occupied the White House. You got Oprah. You got Michael Jordan. You got LeBron James. You got all these folks with influence and wealth and power. So you can't tell me that there's been no accomplishment nor any type of achievement. But yet we're talking about the collective greater good. We're not talking about a few folks or a few examples here. That's where the critical critique in terms of the messaging that we don't talk about in classroom has become much more of a reality. Let's think about this. So if we're talking about the plight, the success of black people, 4 million black children live in poverty today. And I think that number is actually a little bit higher than that. 4 million black children. 13%. Keep that in mind in terms of the total population. 1 million black people are incarcerated. Part of that system of incarceration goes back to, we can take it back to Richard Nixon, this war on crime. We can take it back to Ronald Reagan. We can take it back to Bill Clinton, that Democrat in the White House with his war on crime, the crime bill of 1994. And you saw a number of black people locked up for smoking weed, a little bit of marijuana, which now people are making a lot of money off of. You got new millionaires. You don't need the drug dealer at the corner of the street with the little beeper of the cell phone selling you dope. The dope man lives in a mansion in suburbia white America here in Massachusetts and other states that have legalized the smoking and the consumption of marijuana. You got 240,000 black people who lost their homes as a result of the foreclosure crisis going back to the Great Recession, resulting in a loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in black savings. Remember, we don't have wealth as it is. The Spotlight group down at the Boston Globe did a really nice investigative reporting series where they measured white wealth in Boston to that of black wealth. And the number is unbelievable, particularly, folks, when we think about the fact that you have to take debt and all kind of things into consideration, the way the credit system is set up too, and what does that mean in terms of black financial resourcefulness. So liberation really has to start with the freedom of getting from underneath the problems and the challenges that exist there too. I need to stop preaching. Never before in American history has a people, black people, witnessed some of the changes, and in many ways you can profess and claim the misery of millions, even when we had a black president in the White House, where we saw the level of basic standards really starting to subside. And I'm talking about things such as health, happiness, going back to Lincoln and Jefferson a little bit more on that, in basic humanity. Harry Belafonte Jr., he recalled his last conversation with Brother King. In that last conversation, this is what King said, and I quote, and I want to quote this. King said, "I've come upon something that disturbs me. We have fought hard and long for integration, as I believe we should have. That's what we have to do as a people. And I know that we will win." That brother went to the grave believing that we will win, but understanding the misery and the suffering that was going to happen. And not just for black and brown folks too, but we're talking about our white brothers, our Asian brothers and sisters and non-binary folks, our indigenous people who've been left out of this market system because of the mere measurement of exploitation that falls under capitalism. So Brother King said, "I know we will win." But here's the hard part that no one wants to talk about every January, when liberals and conservatives want to show how anti-racist they are, when they plaster Facebook pictures and social media pictures of Brother King all over the place. He said, "King, but I've come to believe we're integrating into a burning house." All of that work. That brother died for the souls of black folks. That brother died for the souls of white folks. That brother died for the souls of Asian folks. That brother died for the souls of indigenous folks. And yet he died knowing that we are integrating into a burning house because we've yet to address the level and the problem of mending the color line, because we can't have honest conversations in schools about black liberation. We can't have honest and real conversations about what does white supremacy look like. We can't have conversations about the fact that people who look like me have to be afraid of the type of conversations we have within the power dynamics because we have no wealth nor do we have power. That's the scary thing about being black in America. And I'm just giving you my heart as a part of my soul, that there's real fear without wealth. There's real fear without security. There's real fear, about the sense of marginalization and oppression, wondering where you're going to be at in the next day or the next couple of weeks or the next month or the next few years that are going to happen. The essence of economic inequality, folks, is born out of a simple fact. In the United States, think about it. There are 400 billionaires in the United States, and there are 45 million people living in poverty. And again, one of the things that the color line doesn't discriminate against is the fact that whether you're black, white, brown, indigenous, whatever, poverty is a reality. And yet, those living in poverty, oftentimes because we don't have these conversations about black liberation and race, have been taught in some type of way, whether it's intentionally or not, that they shouldn't organize and recognize that they share the same type of struggle that's there. The struggle becomes real because the white person who sees him, her, themselves struggling blames it on other people. Too many immigrants crossing the line. People taking my job. Man, no one's taking your job. People really worried about the welfare state, assuming that the welfare state really exists just for black folks. And that's not true. These are not parallel facts. They are intersecting facts. There are 400 American billionaires, folks, because there are 45 million Americans living in poverty who cannot make the type of income nor generate the wealth that's necessary. We live in a system oftentimes where profit comes at the expense of the living wage. Corporate executives, other folks making a ton of money within this general notion of living a good life, because so many others are willing to live that good life and not worry about the hardships of others. And this is particularly true when it falls on people of color. The struggle for black liberation oftentimes is not an abstraction, hence an abstract idea molded in isolation from the wider phenomena of economic exploitation and inequality that exists in so many ways. This is real. And I think these are the things that we have to think about. The fact that economic exploitation and inequality that pervades all of American society, it is intimately bound up in many ways, and it is there. When we think about the narrative of black liberation, it requires us going beyond the standard narrative that black people have come a long way, but have a long way to go, which of course says nothing about where it is that we're actually trying to get to. And this is not one of those things where we go back to the American colonization society that existed in the 1820s and the United States is trying to wrestle with, what do we do with all of these enslaved folks? We can't just free black people because, well, by freeing them means that they would be forced to integrate. And Brother King talked about the problem of the burning house with integration. So what we're going to do is we're going to put them on a boat and we're going to send them back to Africa. And a lot of folks were sent back to Africa. We get to the 1920s, here in the 20th century, where that Jamaican brother by the name of Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey is going to really lead one of the largest mass movements, migrational movements of black folks to migrate back to Africa, to find a place where they can call their own community. Because see, in his analysis, that just wasn't going to happen here in the United States. There wasn't going to be this element of political, social, nor economic liberation that was there. Marcus Garvey is going to contend in many ways that in order to find the fullest extent of absolute emancipation, we're going to have to migrate to a place that we can define and we can call our own. Perhaps at its most basic level, folks, black liberation implies a world where black people can live in peace without the constant threat of the social, the economic, the political woes of a society that places almost no value on a vast majority of black lives. And I say that because that's going to come across as a bit controversial. And I welcome a response. I welcome an email. I welcome a conversation about, whoa, brother, what do you mean? That's a bit harsh here. I mean, we're living in the greatest country on the planet. This is the promised land. And if you don't want to be here, then folks should just pack up and leave. But you see, folks have tried to do that. And I'm not saying that folks should leave because, see, here in the United States, as W.B. Du Bois once stated, Africa has much to teach this country. The African American has taught and led this country in a lot of different ways. Running from this country is not a sure means of liberation because, see, the grass is not always greener on the other side. You're going to run in from one problem to the next. And there are folks who are really wrestling trying to think about that. I think we get to this idea that while it is true that when black people get free, everyone gets free. Everyone becomes liberated. Black people in America cannot get free alone. And I think that's an important thing to say. It's going to require, for the progression of black folks, if we think about social progress, that there is this alliance, there's this allyship with folks of all colors, all forms. This sense of unity in which black and white folks cooperate in an interracial way, in which now we're talking about the fact that black healthcare is not a crisis. This element of weathering. And weathering is an interesting term, and I must be honest with y'all, since I am a truth teller. Weathering is a term that I only came in touch with probably about 5, maybe 6 years ago. Started listening to a lot of different lectures and other podcasts and reading different stuff about it. And this is within the healthcare system in which there's been this study that black women who check into hospitals, particularly those who are looking to give birth, have a higher chance of dying in a hospital than that of white folks. Even the state of Massachusetts have recently conducted a study to investigate the problem of this healthcare inequality. Black liberation extends beyond just a healthcare element. Black liberation also means that for me, I can evacuate my policy, the policy that my wife and I have, in which we do not call the cops if we have a problem at home. My wife, this white sister, this amazing white sister that I've been married to for a long period of time, her fear of calling the cops is they'll show up, but assume that there's some type of domestic violence happening and I'm going to be the perpetrator that's there. There is real, genuine fear there, folks. And because of that real, genuine fear that I have to live under, the fact that I know that I'm not sure I can call for help, but I'm going to have to deal with this, keeps me from being liberated. I recently told a neighbor of mine that we don't do that. We don't dial 911 for those particular reasons. And she was stunned and confused and graciously said, well, why? And I gave her an explanation, and she paused and she paused and she paused. And that white sister said, you know what, Eddie? I never thought about it that way. I never thought about the fact that me thinking I may be doing something right furthers you, and this is in my language, from the type of liberation that's necessary, the type of liberation that is needed as we move forward. That is the reality that's here. In that sense, folks, Black liberation is bound up with the projection of human liberation, human dignity, and the social transformation of society. And that social transformation, that sense of that human liberation, that projection that needs to happen has to start with all of us. That means that I have to have this conversation with you. I have to share this information with you so you understand what's going on in my mind. You get this greater sense of Black pathology and a reality that exists for so many folks in a way that we can talk about this. But what we can't do when we talk about Black liberation, when we talk about all matters, when it comes to issues of the show, Race Matters, is say, I greatly disagree with you, Brother Carson. You're absolutely wrong. How in the world could you think that? You see, I think that because I've lived it. It is my reality. And let me be honest to folks like my mother, my dad, folks who grew up in Jim Crow America. My life is much better because of them. My life is much better because folks had to die at the hands of white supremacy. The Medgar Evers, for example, the folks who made sacrifices for me. And not just Black folks, but also the white folks too, who believed in Black liberation. The folks who decided that, you know what? I'm going to fight, I'm going to campaign, I'm going to educate myself because I believe that the only way we can fully achieve human liberation is if we achieve Black liberation first. And Black liberation can't happen when we don't talk about any of this stuff in our classrooms. Black liberation can't happen when we're afraid to pick up books to talk about things that may make us uncomfortable. Black liberation can't transpire when we're unwilling to be critical of things that we love, of institutions that we love, of monuments that have values, of things that we have to ask ourselves, is it time that we put that aside for the fact that Black liberation is important? You know, I mentioned a couple weeks ago to some folks that there's still roughly over 700 Confederate monuments in existence in this country. And people will say, well, that's just part of my heritage. Brother Carson, you know, I fly this Confederate flag because I'm Southern. What about the folks living in Newburyport who fly that Confederate flag or some of the surrounding areas? Is that a part of your heritage, or is that part of the heritage of reminding me that liberation has not fully come to absolute fruition. Those are the things that we got to think about. We need to talk about how do we critique the type of things we're studying in our classes that really make my narrative one that's unpronounced, and that of other folks' narrative too. This white-centered history that talks about the greatness of a country that's founded on the greatness and the legacies of whiteness at the exploitation and at the expense of black and brown and indigenous and other folks here too, who also contributed to various aspects of labor, even if that labor was forced labor. Those are the things that we have to think about. Those are the things that we have to wrestle with. So as we talk about race matters, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this in so many different ways. And people, I'm not done talking about black liberation. There are going to be other shows dedicated to this. We still need to think about the idea that black liberation doesn't happen until white folks understand that they have an identity. There is a true identity known as whiteness. And whiteness is something that is not invisible, but yet oftentimes become invisible, becomes the average normative narrative of what does it mean to be an American, the ideal sense of, oh, I'm white. I don't have to think about these things. Well, I don't have to think about these things until I dial up Brother Carson and hear him rant about black liberation when that brother is free to express and do whatever he wants. That's not true. I am talking about a collective group of folks. And let me say this as I bring this to an end, people. I don't speak for all black folks. I speak for Brother Carson. But I also speak the truth because I'm a truth teller. And part of that truth really delves into this idea of the fact that we have to be hard and honest on this stuff. Even if it makes us uncomfortable, if we talk about the economic wealth gaps and the inequalities, the levels of educational attainment that many folks of color, particularly black folks, were never able to achieve. Why? Because they come out of households that were Jim Crow for a long period of time, because of the inequities of credit systems, the inequities of migrating through different types of systems within this economy, in which many folks cannot achieve. I come from a household where we didn't have the family house or the family of the family house. There's no inheritance. And again, that's not true for all folks. I'm talking about me. But that's true for a lot of people when we talk about the wage gap between black and white, the health inequities, the educational inequities, all the things that are keeping us from getting to a point of thinking about black liberation. Folks, I appreciate your time listening to Race Matters here. Dialing it up a little bit. Brother, I get a little excited at times. I want us to have a conversation, but I don't want you just to hit the switch and say, I don't want to listen to anything this brother has to say. Feel free to email me at racematterspodcast@gmail.com. And I am more than welcome to have a conversation. Better yet, if you want to have a really intimate conversation in which you disagree with me on, email me and I'll invite you onto the show. And we'll have a conversation in which at the end, we're going to break bread. We're going to have a glass of wine. We're going to do the things that soul brothers and sisters and non-binary people do, because we have to be about the reality of the human race. Humanism is real. We have to recognize our differences, because I want you to see my blackness as much as I must see your whiteness, as much as I must see your Asianness, your indigenous, your brownness, whatever background you come from. Because the only way we're going to conquer the race problem in this country is to talk about it. And that's why we're here, folks. We're here to talk about it. All right. Thank you. I'm going to bring us to the end. Peace out. I welcome everybody, yet I look forward to seeing you next week. And, one thing I do want to say briefly, speaking of next week, is my guest last week, Bill Quigley, one of the major organizers of the Race and Slavery Conference in New England. That symposium is happening at the Governor's Academy on October the 11th. You can go to the webpage of the Museum of Old Newberry and you can register to attend that. Thank you, folks. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your attention. This is Race Matters.